For 16 years, from 1989 through 2004, Booknotes was C-SPAN's signature author interview program. Focusing exclusively on contemporary nonfiction, the Booknotes series created an unparalleled television forum for writers of history, biography, politics, and public and cultural affairs. The Booknotes format was simple: one author, one book, 1 hour. For a full hour every Sunday night, 52 weeks a year, nonfiction writers were asked to discuss their most recent work. Beyond the book's subject matter, authors were also queried about their research, their writing process, and their own lives and influences. The result is a body of televised interviews that serve as a lasting scholarly resource for authors, researchers, students, readers, and educators. George Mason University Libraries is now adding to this trove of information by re-interviewing selected authors about their experiences as part of the Booknotes series.
Good morning. Today is Monday, June 2nd, 2014, and we are interviewing author Marvin Olasky, who appeared on Booknotes on January 22nd, 1995, to discuss his book, The Tragedy of American Compassion. Good morning, Professor Olasky. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much for joining us, sir.
I am very glad to be with you.
I would like to know, how did your book come to be on Booknotes?
Well, the entire situation was a real surprise to me. Early in 1995, in what was touted as Newt Gingrich's inaugural address, he had just become Speaker of the House. He was talking on national television, giving his inaugural address, and suddenly, in a discussion of American history and welfare reform, he suddenly said that I commend to all of you Marvin Olasky's book, The Tragedy of American Compassion. I didn't have any advance notice of that. I think people around the country hearing that would, of course, be asking, Marvin who? Tragedy what? And suddenly this became a sensation among reporters because the individual, namely me in the book, completely unknown, and all the attention being paid to Newt and what his agenda would be. What is this book? And reporters were going around trying to get a copy of it. There weren't any copies available at that point because this also came as a total surprise to the publisher, Regnery. And for some reason, the incredibly fine interviewer and president, I believe, of C-SPAN became interested in this also. And he, as he told me, went around to a bunch of bookstores, spent several hours, I think he said, trying to get a copy of it, and found it. And then suddenly got a call, can you come on Booknotes?
Mm-hmm.
Which I really was not particularly familiar.
Yeah.
So that was also a surprise.
He had, I believe in the interview, he talks about having to go all the way out to Herndon to find the book, which is, a considerable distance from, the C-SPAN studios to find the book.
Yeah.
And that was...
This impressed me also, and certainly beyond the normal call of duty, but great valor on the part of the journalist to go all the way out to Herndon.
So how did you prepare for your appearance on Booknotes?
I did not. I was, again, this was all a surprise. I was committed to teaching a week-long journalism course for graduate students in theology, seminary students at Reformed Theological Seminary in Jackson, Mississippi. So I went and did that, and was totally occupied in that, and then flew up to Washington for a conference that had long been scheduled. There was a quarterly meeting, it may have been bi-monthly at that point, of pro-life leaders from around the country, and so I went up to Washington for that. And and these were day-long conferences, that occurred every 2 or 3 months at that point. And I had agreed to go over to be on Booknotes. So right in the middle of the meeting, I just, which again, it was in probably just a couple of blocks away from the studios in Washington. I just headed over there, figuring, okay, this is an hour it's going to take, and then I'm going to come right back to the meeting. So I had done no preparation at all for it, and didn't really. Again, I wasn't familiar with Booknotes. I knew C-SPAN, but in my mind, the reach of C-SPAN was very limited. So I wasn't thinking of it as a big deal. I was just going to go over and do it quickly, and then come back to the meeting discussing where the pro-life movement was going.
Well, let's discuss your appearance on Booknotes. What do you remember most from the show? And if you could describe the office and the setting and what the staging of the interview itself was like.
I don't remember anything
Okay.
of the office and the setting and the staging. What I do remember is this. I mean, two things, in fact. Number one, our wonderful interviewer is very does not insert himself into the interview in terms of debating or talking about himself in any way. I've had interviewers who have spent much of the time talking about their own reactions to the book, what they think about the book, how they grew up. It's basically an opportunity for the interviewers to talk about themselves. That wasn't the case here, but he did want to ask some precise questions on the setting in which I heard. Suddenly heard the Newt Gingrich referring to my book again as a big surprise, and so I interpreted his questions very, very literally. He asked right at the beginning of the interview, so where were you when you heard this speech or listening to it? And so I, again, in a very literal way, said, well, let's see, I was in the kitchen, and I was just wandering around, and then I heard him say this, and I went into the living room, and he goes, okay, what city were you in? So I was in Austin, Texas at that point. So I remember that, feeling very foolish at that point, but then, it was he had actually read the book and read it very thoroughly, and so that was a delight, because most interviewers, as I learned, never read the book.
Well, Booknotes' hour-long format differed greatly from most of the network television interviews, which lasted 3 minutes or less. What do you think are the benefits and or drawbacks of this longer format for the author and for the viewer?
Well, the other thing that I remember very, very clearly about it, along with my lack of clarity or lack of memory and other things, is that once it appeared on Booknotes, I got a huge amount of letters and email at that point, and other responses to it. In other words, this was a time, because I was such an unknown, and this was a unknown book, and it was suddenly of such magnitude, that there were lots of interviews that all came in at once, and I took seriously the CBS and NBC and other type of network interviews. And as I mentioned, I really wasn't taken very seriously and wasn't really preparing for the C-SPAN interview. But I think I received at least 10 times as many responses and questions and queries concerning the C-SPAN interview as those on CBS or NBC. And, a couple of things I can think of there. Number one, the long form, the hour long as opposed to the 3 minutes. And secondly, those who do watch C-SPAN, highly involved, highly motivated, highly interested, as opposed to just the incidental interest that someone, watching CBS or NBC with 1,000 other things on his mind is likely to have.
Well, judging from the extensive marginalia in his books, it appears Mr. Lamb read them thoroughly before the interview. He marked them up rather extensively. Do you find this to be normal for interviewers, and how does this change the interview process?
No, that is very abnormal for interviewers. I probably did during those initial months, certainly at least 100 interviews, and the percentage of interviewers who actually had read the book was probably not more than 10%, and the percentage of interviewers who had read it very, very carefully and probably made marginal notes may have been 1%, namely Brian Lamb himself and no one else.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mr. Lamb asked about an author's research and writing methods. Do you believe the reading public finds these details about the practice of writing interesting? And do you think other authors or publishers find them interesting as well?
I suspect part of the reading public finds them interesting, and again, a higher percentage of those who watch Booknotes than probably anything else find that interesting. Most may not, but that's hard for me to judge. Yeah, I think other writers find this interesting. How you do it. When I've taught beginning writers, and I've done that a lot, yeah, they always want to know where do you do it, how do you do it, how many words do you want to write a day, or do you try to write a day, and now these days just about everyone uses, of course, computers and so forth. Back then, it's a question of, well, do you use a computer? Do you use a typewriter? Do you write it by hand? I mean, Shelby. I think younger writers in particular are really interested in the techniques and interested in, do you have a particular time of the day do you write? Do you try to keep a regular schedule? Where exactly do you write? Can you write anywhere? Can you write on a bus, on a train, on a plane, or do you have to do it in a particular office? Yeah, those questions I think are very interesting to young authors. Older authors probably set in their ways, not so interesting. General public probably not so interesting.
Well, Dr. Olasky, you are both a journalist and a historical author. Do you go about
Good question. There's a at the margins there's a blurring, but fundamentally probably yes. For most history, unless you're dealing with people who are still alive, it's much more a question of records and libraries and writing. Most journalism is largely a question of talking with people and going places and so forth. So that's very different. The basic thought process. What's happened and why it happened. And in fact, the same who, what, when, where, why, how the journalists use is also important to historians.
Mm-hmm.
And then in writing, a journalist is always looking for action and asking questions. Who's my protagonist? Who's my antagonist? What's the mission of the protagonist? What obstacles does he face? That's where you need to keep it lively, and I think the same thing pertains to historical writing. The best writers of history books are often people who have some journalistic training. I'm thinking of, for example, Rodney Stark, for many years at the University of Washington, now at Baylor, who writes on religious history, was a journalist early on, and that helps a lot, even on what can often be as abstract a topic as theological and philosophical battles. He brings a journalist's sensibility to it in terms of trying to develop a narrative and keeping it moving. So, I think there are a lot of overlaps, and if historians think journalistically, it's like their product is likely to be far more readable than if they are pure academics.
Very interesting. Well, Mr. Lamb frequently asked his guests biographical questions. Did that surprise you, and is this generally different from most author interviews you have experienced?
No, in fact, I'm just thinking of many interviews. People really do want to get into the biographical questions, especially if there seems to be something mysterious about the author. The question, in fact, in the Tragedy of American Compassion, towards the end, one adventure of a sort that I went on after doing 6 months of research at the Library of Congress. It was March, and the weather was getting a little less cold in Washington, and I decided to go out for a couple of days dressed as a homeless guy with some tape on my glasses and wearing a couple of odoriferous T-shirts and sweatshirt and so forth. And I just wanted to find out what kinds of services. I've been writing or researching the history of trying to help people who are poor, and particularly often folks who are homeless. So I wanted to go out and just see what kinds of services, food, clothing, shelter, medicine, would be offered to homeless people in Washington today. And I did that and found an interesting experience and educational. I wasn't trying to get into the mindset of a homeless person, but just in terms of services, there was plenty of stuff offered to me, but there was never any personal care or concern. That one page in the book, is probably what the interviewers who actually read the book, and maybe even the publicist at that point, sent out something directing them to that. That one page was the page I got the most questions off from interviewers generally, because they were interested in the biography, and they were interested in that particular bit of personal research as opposed to library research. So, yeah, I don't think. I mean, the length of time, of course, that Brian Lamb spent on this was very different, but I don't think the interest in biography was different than the normal.
Were there any questions that he asked that surprised you?
Well, besides, well, where were you exactly when you heard about this? Which I guess should always surprise me, but it did. I don't recall any, but I just remember coming away from it and thinking, wow, he actually read the book and is thinking about the implications of it. So I was very impressed. But again, I left at the end of the hour and didn't really expect much to come out of it.
Did you watch Booknotes before or after your own interview? And if so, why? And did your experience on the show change your impressions of it?
No, I didn't watch it before. There were several times I watched it afterwards, not on a regular basis, but I now knew about it, and sometimes when there were particular authors, there were several times I tuned in, but it wasn't a regular thing. Yeah, it certainly did change my impression of it, namely the reach of it, and the reach of C-SPAN at that point, which surprised me. And after that, a few times I went on C-SPAN when I was in Washington on the early morning show, discussing events of the day, and I always enjoyed doing it. So after that, as opposed to thinking, well, C-SPAN is subprime, with prime being the major networks at that point. After that, I always wanted to go on C-SPAN whenever the occasion made it possible.
So one of our questions is about the difference in sales or national attention for your book after you discussed it on Booknotes. And so you're basically telling me that not only did you get what they call the C-SPAN spike in sales, but you became more of a, I don't want to use the word celebrity, but you became more of an asset for as a person who can discuss
to separate the C-SPAN bump from the general bump that was going on right then, because Newt was suddenly bursting upon the national scene, and then suddenly talking about this unknown book. There were lots of profiles, Wall Street Journal, and lots of other national publications, just about all of them, in fact. So there was that spike from that, and I think the book notes was the single, certainly the best interview of that whole time in terms of the preparation of the interviewer and the questions he was asking. And again, a lot of I do suspect that it greased sales of the book, but I don't know how much, because it was getting a lot of publicity in other areas also at the same time.
Right. The Booknotes series focused entirely on nonfiction books published between the late 1980s and 2004. What do you think might be the advantages of an 800-book collection, as this collection now is, with that particular nonfiction focus?
Well, it would certainly it would tell you a lot about what one very perceptive and intelligent reader, Brian Lamb, thought were the most interesting books coming out of that whole period. Would it be representative generally of what was going on in publishing and in nonfiction publishing during that period? That I don't know. Would the books generally be readable? Yes. Would they all be incisive? That I don't know, but it would certainly be a window on American nonfiction writing during all those years.
Brian Lamb and C-SPAN in the Booknote series had a rule that authors could only appear on the program one time. If asked, would you have returned for another interview?
Sure.
Did your experience with Brian Lamb and Booknotes cause you to rethink any of your own approaches or assumptions regarding your research or writing?
Not that I recall.
Okay. And what have you been working on after this book? I know, of course, your work as the editor-in-chief of World Magazine, but can you describe some of the other books you've been working on, and what have you found in them that has pleased you?
Well, there were 3 sequels to The Tragedy of American Compassion.
Mm-hmm.
One that largely as a result of all this attention from Booknotes and others that I started writing right away, which was, see if I even remember the title of it, Renewing American Compassion,
mm-hmm.
which was a more journalistic attempt that summarized some of the themes of the tragedy of American Compassion, but then tried to make some new applications of it, in particular in relation to the welfare reform debate of '95 and '96. And then there was when then Governor George W. Bush read the book and was interested in it, and I started doing a little bit of volunteer work with him. That led to a book that I traveled around the country to research in 1999, called Compassion and Conservatism,
mm-hmm.
and came out in 2000. And then later another book on after Katrina, which was called the Politics of Disaster. So there were those 3 books. There were books on other how their religious life and their personal life influenced their behavior, and a couple of other books along those lines. One on called The Religions Next Door, that grew out of a comparative religion course I was teaching at the University of Texas. So it had chapters on Hinduism and Buddhism and Islam and Judaism, and a couple other things like that. But largely, most of my work, really 20 years, has been with World and editing it and writing columns and articles for it.
Well, in your estimation, what has been the lasting impact of Booknotes in the then contemporary American society and perhaps in subsequent times?
Well, certainly drew public attention to a lot of books that otherwise would have largely gone unmentioned. I mean, one of the things, and I still don't know where Mr. Lamb is politically, but he did not seem to. And again, I haven't done a study of all the books and the authors he interviewed,
Mm-hmm.
but it strikes me that he did not care particularly about political correctness. So he interviewed authors from all over the political spectrum, and that was important because NBC and CBS and ABC would tend to puff certain types of books that were more on the liberal side of the spectrum, and I don't think that was the general tilt of Brian. So, I think that probably future historians, if they go back and look at the books that he, the authors that he interviewed, would find would see a much more interesting discussion concerning American life than if they just looked at the lead reviews from the New York Times or the New York Review of Books or others. So a broader understanding of America would come out of that, and what influence that's had, I don't know, but I suspect that it did help the discourse over all those years, because a whole variety of different types of ideas were put forth, and not just those that were politically correct.
Well, is there anything that you would like to add regarding the Booknotes program, C-SPAN, or Brian Lamb?
Well, actually, I mean, maybe not so much for this purpose, but I over the past over the past 7 years now, I have first at the King's College in New York City, and now at Patrick Henry College, located just outside of Washington,
Mm-hmm.
brought in people for interviews in front of the students. And I try to do it, basically, I try to talk as little as possible and ask questions to encourage the authors. The books. So, I've just I have admired his way of interviewing. Again, not inserting himself, being, as journalists like to call it, more a fly on the wall, a talking fly in his case, because he has to ask a few questions. But they're not long questions, and he's always trying to push the respondents to give specific detail about how they write and Brian's interviewing technique. And if you will give me or send me contact information for him, I would like to interview him before Patrick Henry College students sometime next winter or spring.
So, Dr. Olasky, thank you for agreeing to do this oral history interview and for sharing with us your experiences on this groundbreaking television interview program. Thank you so much,
Very
sir.
good.